In June of 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin went hiking with his family in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It was a normal day, clear weather, familiar trails. Nothing about the hike suggested danger. Dennis was walking just ahead of his parents and siblings, playing a harmless game, hiding behind bushes to jump out and scare them. It was the kind of moment families remember fondly. And then, suddenly, Dennis didn't come back out from behind the trees. At first, no one panicked. They called his name, expecting him to laugh and reveal himself. Seconds passed, then minutes. Dennis had vanished in the time it takes to look away. There was no sound, no movement, no sign of where he had gone. The area wasn't steep or remote. He shouldn't have been able to disappear at all. What followed was one of the largest search efforts the park had ever seen. Over 1,400 people were involved. Park rangers, volunteers, search dogs, even US Army Green Berets trained in survival and tracking. Helicopters scanned from above, while teams combed the forest on foot. If Dennis had walked away, fallen, or been injured nearby, someone should have found something. Footprints, torn clothing, a trail. They found nothing. Then the weather changed. A sudden, violent storm rolled in, drenching the area with heavy rain. Whatever trace Dennis might have left, scent, footprints, disturbed ground, was effectively erased. Searchers later admitted that once the storm hit, their chances dropped dramatically. It was as if the forest had closed itself off. But the most disturbing detail didn't come from the search teams. It came from another family in the park that same day. They reported hearing a scream echo through the woods, a scream they described as terrified and unnatural. It came from the general area where Dennis had disappeared. Searchers followed up on the report, but nothing ever came of it. No evidence, no confirmation. Just a sound hanging in the air, with no explanation attached. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The search continued far longer than most cases, but eventually it slowed. No body was ever recovered, no belongings, no definitive cause. Officially, Dennis Martin simply disappeared. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just that a child went missing. It's how quickly it happened. How many trained people searched. How completely he vanished. And how, after all these years, there is still no answer that fits the facts. In July of 2015, Dior Kunz Jr., who was just 2 years old, was reported missing from a campsite in a remote part of Idaho. Unlike many wilderness disappearance cases, this one did not involve someone hiking alone or venturing off unexpectedly. Dior was with several adults at the campsite, and his disappearance was noticed quickly. According to those present, Dior had been playing nearby shortly before he was last seen. When he could no longer be located, authorities were contacted and search efforts began within hours. Law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and volunteers canvassed the surrounding area, focusing first on the most likely scenario, that a small child had wandered away. What complicated the search almost immediately was the lack of physical evidence. Tracking dogs were unable to pick up a consistent scent leading away from the campsite. Cadaver dogs later gave alerts in a few locations, but these did not result in any recoveries. Despite repeated searches, no footprints, clothing, or personal items belonging to Dior were ever found. As the investigation progressed, attention shifted from the environment to the people who had been with him that day. Investigators noted inconsistencies in how events were described, including differences in timelines and accounts of where Dior had been playing. These discrepancies raised questions and led to further interviews, but no clear conclusion was reached, and no one was charged in connection with his disappearance. What makes this case continue to stand out is not just the unanswered questions, but the absence of anything concrete. In situations involving young children, searches typically uncover at least some indication of what occurred. In Dior's case, there was nothing. No trail, no location, no explanation that fully accounted for his disappearance. Nearly a decade later, Dior Kunz Jr. has still not been found. His case remains open, serving as one of the most troubling examples of how a child can vanish from a monitored space without leaving behind answers. In 1952, 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing with his older brother on his family's ranch in rural Oregon. The two had been near a barn on the property, spending time together as they often did. When it was time for lunch, Keith's brother was called inside. Keith didn't follow him. He stayed behind in the barn. A short time later, their mother went back outside to bring Keith in. When she reached the barn, he was gone. Within moments, it became clear that Keith had vanished from the property without a trace. A search began almost immediately. Family members checked the surrounding ranch land, nearby structures, and open areas where a child might wander. Given Keith's age, the assumption was that he couldn't have gone far. He was only 2 years old, and the terrain beyond the immediate property was rough and uneven. The weather conditions made the situation even more serious, as temperatures were cold enough for exposure to become a concern. As the hours passed, the search expanded. Neighbors, local authorities, and volunteers joined in, covering more ground as night approached. Despite the growing number of people involved, no footprints, disturbed ground, or belongings were found. There was nothing to suggest a clear direction of travel. 19 hours after Keith disappeared, searchers found him alive. The location stunned everyone involved. Keith was discovered 12 miles away from his family's ranch. The distance alone was difficult to understand, but the terrain between the two locations raised even more questions. The route involved rough ground that experienced adults found challenging to cross. Keith was cold and dehydrated, but conscious and responsive. There were no serious injuries that explained how he had traveled such a distance. For a child his age, surviving overnight in those conditions and reaching that location at all seemed almost impossible. To better understand what might have happened, a wilderness expert attempted to retrace the path Keith would have needed to take. Even with proper gear and experience, the expert struggled with the terrain. The attempt only emphasized how unlikely the journey would have been for a 2-year-old acting alone. Keith Parkins survived, and his story is often remembered as a remarkable survival case. But the questions surrounding his disappearance have never fully gone away. How he traveled 12 miles, how he navigated difficult terrain, and how he avoided serious injury remain unclear. What makes this case stand out isn't speculation or added mystery. It's the physical reality of what occurred. A toddler vanished from a familiar place, crossed miles of rough land, and was found alive less than a day later. Even decades later, the facts alone are difficult to explain. In November of 2015, 82-year-old Tom Messick went hunting with friends in the Adirondacks. This was not a remote expedition or an unfamiliar location. Tom had hunted in these woods for years. It was a place locals knew well, the kind of forest people returned to every season. That morning, Tom was positioned at a fixed spot, sitting on a bucket watching for deer, while his friends spread out nearby. They were within hearing distance of one another, positioned so that any movement or noise would likely be noticed. Tom was not hiking, exploring, or moving through the woods. He was waiting. At some point, his friends returned to check on him. Tom was gone. At first, they assumed he had moved or gone back toward the road, but there was no sound, no call, no sign that he had stood up or walked away. His bucket was still there. His rifle was gone, suggesting he had left intentionally, but beyond that, there was nothing. Search efforts began almost immediately. Law enforcement, forest rangers, volunteers, helicopters, and tracking dogs were brought in. The area was searched extensively and repeatedly. If Tom had walked out, collapsed, or fallen nearby, investigators believed something should have been found. Nothing was. There were no tracks leading away from his position, no disturbed ground, no indication of direction. Tracking dogs were unable to establish a clear trail. Despite the rapid response and the scale of the search, Tom Messick seemed to have vanished from a known location without leaving any physical evidence behind. What makes this case especially difficult to explain is the context. Tom was 82 years old. He was not covering long distances. He was not alone, deep in unfamiliar wilderness. He was seated in a specific place, with others close enough that movement or distress should have been noticed. And yet, he disappeared silently. The search continued for days, then weeks, but no trace of Tom Messick was ever found. No clothing, no remains, no definitive explanation. Over time, the active search was scaled back, but the case was never resolved. For many people, what makes this disappearance so unsettling is how ordinary the setting was. This wasn't an isolated mountain range or miles of unexplored terrain. It was a familiar forest, one people hunt, hike, and walk through every year. Tom Messick went missing in a place where someone should have seen something, but no one did. Nearly a decade later, his disappearance remains unexplained. not because of rumors or theories, but because an elderly man vanished from a fixed position in broad daylight with others nearby and was never found. In the summer of 1981, 14-year-old Stacey Ann Aris traveled to Yosemite National Park with her father and a small group of family friends. The trip was meant to be memorable in the best way. They planned a guided horseback ride through the high country, followed by an overnight stay near one of the park's backcountry camps. Stacey was described as curious and creative, and she brought a camera with her to document the experience. After several hours on horseback, the group reached their campsite and began setting up for the evening. The area wasn't isolated in the way people often imagine when they think of wilderness disappearances. This was a known route used regularly by hikers and riders, and not far from other camps and trails. As preparations were underway, Stacey asked if she could walk a short distance to explore a nearby lake and take photographs. She was given permission. It was not meant to be a long excursion. Stacey never came back. When she didn't return within a reasonable amount of time, concern set in. Her father and others went looking for her, calling her name and checking the immediate area. When they found no sign of her, park authorities were alerted and a formal search began. What followed was one of the most extensive search efforts Yosemite had seen at the time. Rangers, search and rescue teams, volunteers, helicopters, and tracking dogs were deployed. The terrain around the lake and surrounding trails was carefully examined. Investigators believed that if Stacey had fallen, become injured, or wandered off course, there would be some indication of where she'd gone. The only item ever recovered was part of her camera, a lens found near the area she'd gone to explore. No other belongings were located. No clothing, no footprints that led to a clear destination, no evidence that explained what had happened next. Days passed, then weeks. The search continued, but it yielded nothing. Despite the proximity to established trails and other people in the park, Stacey Ann Aris was never found. Her disappearance quickly became one of Yosemite's most baffling cases, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the absence of answers. What makes Stacey's disappearance especially haunting is how ordinary the moment was. She didn't set out on a dangerous journey. She didn't leave camp in distress. She walked a short distance in daylight, in a national park visited by thousands of people every year, and vanished. More than 4 decades later, Stacey Ann Aris remains missing. Her story is remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a reminder of how quickly someone can disappear, even in places that feel safe, familiar, and well-traveled. Yosemite remains as vast and beautiful as ever, but the question of what happened to Stacey Aris still lingers quietly in its history.